At this point, it seems like we're not going to be getting a ban list before Nationals, and so today I'm coming at you guys with a tier list for the post-Infinite Forbidden format, right around the time when both the NAWCQ and the EUWCQ would be happening. Before we get into it, I just want to quickly go over the tiers. BDIF for the best deck in the format. Strong contenders, these are decks that could very easily take the win and definitely have the potential to, but are slightly behind the best deck of the format. Dark Horse decks, I think, are pretty interesting because they're not exactly rogue decks, but they may be decks that just can't really consistently compete with the top decks out there without getting a little bit lucky or without the pilot being incredibly skilled at the deck. So I think a lot of things have to go right for a Dark Horse deck to be able to make it far in the tournament, but these decks are definitely strong enough that they actually can make it far. And finally, decks that are just not good. I think that while these decks are technically playable, I think they're just going to be a lot better choices out there. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into the tier list. And I think without a doubt, everyone saw this coming. Snake Eyes Fiendsmith definitely going to be the best deck in the format. This deck is kind of leagues ahead of every other deck out there. You have so many starters and extenders, a strong resilience to hand traps, ability to just keep pushing even when you do get stopped. So I feel like there's not too much to say about this deck. Assuming everyone has access to the Fiendsmith cards, this is probably going to be the most represented deck, and I definitely wouldn't be surprised if this deck ultimately ends up taking the entire event at both NA and EU. Next up is Yugioh, and I think Yugioh is definitely a close second right behind Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. Yugioh is probably at the top of the strong contender list, and I would say it's probably the second best deck going into both of these events. Yugioh is kind of like Snake Eyes Fiendsmith in the sense that it has the ability to play through hand traps very well, but is slightly burdened by the fact that it has to play a few more bricks, and it doesn't necessarily have as many combo starters as a deck like Snake Eyes Fiendsmith does. However, Yugioh has a set of unique strengths as well that Snake Eyes Fiendsmith doesn't have, so I think that there is definitely an argument to actually play Yugioh over Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. Yugioh is a deck that generally is a lot harder to play against and a lot harder to know how to hand trap compared to a deck like Snake Eyes Fiendsmith, so I think that could be one reason people actually go with the Yugioh deck instead. Next up is Labyrinth, and Labyrinth is actually in an interesting spot because while Labyrinth is a very adaptable and flexible deck, I think at this point, against the strong contenders and against Snake Eyes Fiendsmith, Labyrinth might actually just not be enough. You could go the route of trying to play as many floodgates as possible, but then going second just becomes a nightmare for you. And if you start playing more of a mid-range Labyrinth deck with like a few hand traps here or there, like Nibiru, Imperm, Ash Blossom, those cards generally just aren't enough to actually stop any of the top decks out there. And it's at a weird spot where you can't really play a mid-range version, and if you want to play like a stun deck, there are just better decks like Runic Stun that do that out there. So I actually think Labyrinth is probably not that great of a choice. That being said, however, I could see an argument for maybe it being considered a Dark Horse deck because there are some pretty skilled Labyrinth players out there that can simply outmaneuver and outplay a lot of these players that might have just picked up these two decks because they thought they were the best in the format. Next up is Tenpai Dragon. Tenpai Dragon I think is probably the third best deck in my opinion. Maybe you can argue it's like top 5, not necessarily third, but it's definitely one of the strongest contenders for both of these events, and the reason being it has the ability to play a lot of hand traps or board breakers. Now, there is still the debate on whether hand traps or board breakers is better with this format, but regardless of whichever one is better, Tenpai just has the ability to play so many of them that you're likely going to be able to see multiples and actually be able to successfully crack through some of these boards that these decks set up, or even just prevent them from making the boards in the first place. Now, Tenpai Dragon does have a weakness, and that being it is a going second deck, and that can be very risky into a lot of these decks out there because you are heavily relying on seeing those non-engine cards for you to actually win the game, because your engine by itself is probably not going to win you the game unless your opponent had a very weak start. So while I do think Tenpai is a very strong deck, these two decks definitely outclass it, and a Tenpai player probably needs to have a good day in order to actually be able to take down the whole event. Next up is Plants, and Plants I actually think is interesting because it's in a similar category in my opinion as the combo decks out there. I think that it has a very strong engine like these two decks out there. It's able to put up massive boards. It has a decent amount of extension through some interruptions, but the thing that makes it a lot worse than these decks is it just can't play that many pieces of non-engine. You have to solely rely on seeing like maybe your 6 to 9 copies of non-engine cards in your deck when you're going second. It's not a solid enough amount to play, in my opinion, in a format that's dominated by these two decks up here. So while I do think it has the potential to do very well, the lack of non-engine space is going to hold it back. Now that being said, once again, I'm going to put it in Dark Horse because I think that there are a lot of skilled Plant players out there, and Plant is a deck that not a lot of people are super familiar with, so it may be more difficult for them to actually properly hand trap the deck, meaning as a good Plant player, you might have the opportunity to take some opponents by surprise and ultimately take down the event. Branded is, of course, a very strong deck as well. I would have to put it at like the bottom of strong contender, maybe top of Dark Horse. I just feel like Branded's engine is so incredibly strong. Going first and even going second, it does have the potential to actually do something against like some sort of boards out there. But once again, it suffers from a similar problem as Plants does, and that's the fact that it just can't play that many non-engine cards. Granted, I think its engine is probably a little better at cracking boards than Plants is, but then again, you're in the same boat in the sense that you have to see maybe your 6 to 9 copies of non-engine cards in your deck, and that's just not a great number when you're facing down these two decks up here. So while I do think it has a very strong engine, has the auto win in Gimmick Puppet that a lot of decks can't deal with, especially if they're playing board breakers and not hand traps, I do feel like Branded is probably one of those decks that you do kind of have to respect, but I wouldn't really expect it to take down the entire event. Next up is Pure Melodious. Pure Melodious is pretty interesting because it has the ability to play a lot of non-engine cards, and I think that's super important. That's this format. If you've noticed, a lot of the top decks out here are good because they have the ability to play a lot of strong non-engine cards, and I think the Melodious engine itself is quite solid as well. It's a consistent deck with a lot of starters. It has a okay end board. It's not the most in terms of interruption. It does give you strong follow-up, and you are of course going to have to rely a bit on the non-engine you see, but that being said, I do feel like it is a little bit better than Plants because it is able to play a few more non-engine cards. It is able to play Herald of Orange Light, which is probably one of the best non-engine cards out there aside from a card like Shifter. It does have the ability to play through some hand traps as well. I do think this is a Dark Horse deck that ultimately could do well with the skilled pilot and if the player has a really good day. Next up is Pure Kashtira, and I think Pure Kashtira is actually a very solid anti-meta pick. Kashtira, of course, is able to play Dimension Shifter, and Dimension Shifter kind of just destroys most of the decks in the format. Kashtira is in a pretty good spot to where they're actually able to play a very large number of non-engine cards since their engine is quite small and compact, and they are able to play huge blowout non-engine cards like Dimension Shifter, which just slaughters the top decks out there. I would say this is probably at the top of my Dark Horse list. I would definitely wouldn't be surprised if one or two of these sneaks into top cut of both of these events, just because it has some solid choices going first. Kashtira Unicorn is going to be very strong. Now that most decks are going to be playing the Fiendsmith engine, you could simply just rip the Link 1 or the Link 2 out of their extra deck, and that would just make it so the Fiendsmith engine just doesn't do that much, if anything at all. I do think that going second, this deck is okay as well. Of course, it's not as strong as some of these other decks up here, but that being said, I feel like the fact that it can play such strong non-engine definitely makes it a strong Dark Horse deck in my opinion. Next up is Chimera, and I think that Chimera is similar to Branded in the sense that it's a very strong combo deck when it goes first. It does have sort of a lock like Branded where they're able to summon the Dark Barrier statue, which can be good against some decks, but I would say it's pretty much just like a straight downgrade from Branded in my opinion. I'll put it at like the bottom of the Dark Horse tier. I think it's an okay deck still, but it does suffer similar problems as like some of the other decks in here where it just can't play that much non-engine, and its engine is just, in my opinion at least, a little bit weaker than Branded's, but I just don't think that it's going to ultimately do that well unless the player gets pretty lucky. Next up is Sprite. Sprite actually did win a Nationals, I believe, for South America, and that's pretty interesting to me because I actually feel like Sprite as a deck is definitely not bad, but I wouldn't say it's like one of the better ones out there. One key strength I will note is that it is able to play a solid amount of non-engine, and its own engine is fairly flexible as well. I think it falls in a similar boat as a deck like Melodious or Kashtira. It's pretty strong going first, can play a decent amount of non-engine, but ultimately its engine just falls a little bit short compared to some of these other decks up here. Next up is Voiceless Voice. It used to be a pretty strong deck and one of the few decks that could actually stand up to Snake Eyes, but now I think that, especially with the introduction of the Fiendsmith engine, the regular end board is just not really going to be enough. You can stop a few of their plays, but every deck's now just going to have essentially one extra layer of extension to help you push through whatever board that you have. And the fact that Voiceless Voice just makes a very like small board and tries to play for follow-up, I think could be a problem for the deck and make it so that it's not really able to hold back any of these super strong decks up here when it's going first. And going second, while it has a decent number of non-engine slots, I do think it falls in a similar boat as some of these other decks out here where its non-engine is not at a point to where it's actually able to consistently stop these top decks up here. I'll give it a little bit of respect. I'll put it at the bottom of Dark Horse. Next up is Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul I only put up here is because it's one of the few decks that can play Dimension Shifter. And while Dimension Shifter is an incredibly strong card against this current format, I feel like Vanquish Soul's engine is just not strong enough at all. Vanquish Soul just doesn't really do enough, and I think that unless you're seeing Shifter every single game, it's just going to be incredibly hard for Vanquish Soul to actually win a game. It's just not a great deck, and while it does have like a few strengths going for it, I don't think it's a good choice for this tournament. Similarly, I think Tierlist unfortunately also isn't a very good choice. Tierlist essentially isn't able to play any non-engine at all. And over the course of a long tournament, if you're trying to play a deck that is pretty reliant on luck, I do think that unless you're having the best like day of your life, there are going to be times where the deck just sort of fails on itself and it kind of loses to itself as well. So I think this type of deck is probably not one that is going to end up doing well at one of these tournaments just because it's so long and the deck has to stay consistent for so many rounds. So unfortunately, I think Tierlist is probably going to go in the not good tier. Next up is Ritual Beast. I think Ritual Beast is a solid deck. It has a fairly strong engine. Its first turn end board is pretty impressive, either Protoss or Colossus, plus a bunch of follow-up. Dimension Shifter is one of those few cards that can completely stop one of these two decks in their tracks. So I feel like the fact that it's able to do that, plus it has a pretty decent engine, I think I'm going to have to put it at the top of the Dark Horse tier. It definitely takes a very skilled pilot that knows what they're doing because this is a very complex deck. And it's going to be pretty tiring to play this deck over the course of so many rounds. And I think that could make it so the player's a little bit more prone to mistakes, which isn't necessarily great for a long tournament. But if you're a very skilled Ritual Beast player, I think you definitely could do well just because of how strong the deck is going first, plus the ability to play Shifter and a decent amount of non-engine when going second. Next up is Flu. I think Flu is literally in the exact same boat as Vanquish Soul. It's probably a little bit better than Vanquish Soul because its engine I think is a little bit stronger. But that being said, it also can't play that many non-engine cards. And while it does have access to stupid cards like Harpy's Feather Storm, the deck just isn't really able to go second unless you see Shifter. Even going first, sometimes its end board might not be enough against some of these decks out here. Plus it has some consistency issues as well, which definitely means over the course of a long tournament there are going to be times where you just end up losing to yourself, which isn't great. Next up is Pearly. A lot of people probably aren't prepared for large towers like monsters since they aren't common in this format, and I think that if Pearly is able to stick a Noir on the board that's just pretty much impossible to out, it can be very difficult for a lot of these decks to actually beat them. Now that being said, however, there are going to be problems with the deck. So I think I'm going to have to probably put it near like the middle of the Dark Horse here. It's like an okay deck in my opinion. They're definitely better choices, but I don't think that Pearly is such a terrible choice that it's like down here with these decks. Next up is Salamangreat. I think Salamangreat is an okay deck as well. It's probably on the same power level as a deck like Sprite in my opinion, where it has a decent enough going first end board and going second has some level of extension that lets it play through interruptions, plus it is able to play an okay number of non-engine as well. Going second, its engine itself isn't very great for breaking boards, so I think I'm gonna have to probably put it near the bottom of Dark Horse tier. It's probably a step above these decks down here, but I don't think it's a deck that's ultimately going to do very well. Next up is Whitewood's Centurion. The strength of this deck is going to be very conditional on whether people choose to play hand traps or board breakers, because if people are pretty much exclusively playing board breakers, just setting up a Calamity on their turn is going to pretty much make it impossible for them to win. It's essentially the same level as Branded in that case where, well, if you don't hand trap me, I'm essentially going to FTK you and win from there. It does have similar problems as Branded in the sense that its engine is fairly big. It's not able to play that many non-engine cards, and its engine isn't necessarily the best at going second. So I think that in the best case scenario where people are playing a lot of board breakers instead of hand traps, I would probably put it near the top of Dark Horse, but in my opinion, I feel like there's still going to be a decent amount of hand traps in the format, so I'm going to just stick it at the top of not good, at least for now. I could be wrong on this one, but from my experience playing against this deck, it did seem a little bit underwhelming at times. Next up is Runic, specifically Runic Stun. Runic Stun, I think, is an interesting deck because it's not really affected by either board breakers or hand traps that people play. So it can kind of just be really ignorant to what people are playing in their decks and sort of just do their own thing. You're able to adapt and play different floodgates to specifically target the best decks of the format. And I think that if people just aren't prepared for Runic, it can set up game states where your opponent simply just doesn't have an out to something like Skill Drain plus a way to protect it. I will unfortunately have to put this like near the bottom of Strong Contender. I think it's probably a top 5 deck, definitely near the bottom of the top 5, but still definitely a very scary deck that I do think you probably have to actually respect a little bit. Even going second, like if you're just setting like 5 cards into your opponent's end board, couple of floodgates could actually slow the game down enough to where they're actually able to come back from there. So I do think that Runic Stun is probably a strong contender, albeit it does have inherent flaws in the sense that it is a trap deck, it's quite slow, and it might have problems with going into time, which is not great for a super long tournament. And then finally, Memento. I think that Memento is a okay deck. I believe it's able to play a fair amount of non-engines, so maybe like 12 or so, but I do think that its engine itself is actually not that bad because it does have quite a few ways to actually extend past its normal summon being stopped. I think that's pretty important for a deck to actually have in order to do well this format. Pair that with the fact that I don't think a lot of people are going to know what the Memento cards do. I think it's probably just a definition of a Dark Horse deck. A very skilled pilot could definitely use it to do super well and run deep in the tournament, but at the end of the day, it does have some flaws that hold it back from competing with some of these top decks up here. So that's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Just remember, this is my opinion and my opinion only. I also only chose what I believe would be the 20 most talked about decks. Of course, there are going to be decks that I missed, so do let me know in the comment section below if you feel like I should have included any and where you'd put those decks in this tier list. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.